and welcome back for another episode of Human Trafficking Hater. On this episode, we are actually starting a brand new series that is going to take a look at every single one of the United States presidents and their views, opinions, efforts, and policies against or for slavery and human trafficking. With the understanding that human trafficking is widely accepted as modern-day slavery, I will be using the terms interchangeably throughout this series. I want to pretext this episode and every episode hereafter with the understanding that I am in no way attacking any of the former presidents or attempting to alter your opinions about them. I'm also not devaluing their accomplishments outside of their views, opinions, efforts, and policies against or for slavery and human trafficking. And yes, I'm aware that 200 plus years ago was a different time and the acceptance of enslaving a fellow human being was more widely accepted then it is in modern times. Lastly, this is not a partisan series, so I will objectively review all the presidents regardless of their political party affiliation. So if you're planning on watching this and attacking me for going after a president based on their party affiliation, please do not waste your time, because everyone from Democrats and Republicans to Whigs and the National Union have in some way supported the enslavement of others for commercial gain. Now that we got that out of the way, on with the episode. At the end of his life, George Washington made the decision to free all of his slaves in his 1799 will. He was the only slaveholding founding father to do so. This single act is significant, especially given the era in which it took place, which is several decades before slavery was formally abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Washington wrote his will several months before his death in December 1799. In the document, Washington left directions for the eventual emancipation of his slaves after the passing of his wife, Martha Washington. Of the 317 enslaved people at Mount Vernon in 1799, 123 of them were owned by George Washington and were eligible to be freed per the terms of his will. Additionally, in accordance with state law, George Washington stipulated in his will that elderly enslaved people or those who were too sick to work were to be supported by his estate in perpetuity. However, the remaining slaves at Mount Vernon did not have to wait for Martha Washington's death to receive their freedom, because in December of 1800, Martha Washington signed a deed of manumission for her deceased husband's slaves. This made it possible for the enslaved to be emancipated on January 1st, 1801. According to Abigail Adams, Martha freeing the slaves early was not an act of kindness, but instead an act of self-preservation, as there was considerable concern that the enslaved may attempt to kill her in an effort to earn their freedom as stipulated in George Washington's will. Other acts of what might be deemed kindness or decency towards those Washington enslaved include the limited use of corporal punishment. This is evidenced when in 1793, Washington's farm manager, Anthony Whitting, accused Charlotte, an enslaved seamstress, of being impudent by arguing with him and refusing to work. As punishment, he whipped her with a hickory switch. Washington's opinion of Mr. Whitting's action was that it was quite very proper. At the same time, Charlotte's response that she had not been whipped for 14 years suggests that physical punishment was sporadic but not unheard of for those who were enslaved by Washington. Washington was revered by other slaves outside of his Mount Vernon estate. One example was Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved woman brought to Boston from West Africa at just 7 years of age. Even as she was enslaved, Wheatley received instruction in subjects ranging from Greek, Latin, and poetry from the daughter of her owners. By age 12, Wheatley began writing poetry, and by 18 had become well known for her work. In the winter of 1775, Wheatley sent Washington a letter containing an ode to the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The poem concluded, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a thorn that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine." Washington responded kindly to Wheatley in a letter and even addressed the letter to Miss Phyllis, an unusually polite way for a member of the gentry to address an enslaved person. Although there is no proof that the two met in person, Washington invited Wheatley in March 1776 to call on him at his headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Underscoring these possibly perceived kind acts is the reality that Phyllis Wheatley was the only enslaved person that Washington ever wrote a letter to. And Washington's endorsement of Charlotte being hit with a hickory switch, regardless of her not being hit in the prior 14 years, is still an acceptance of violence on someone who is clearly already a victim. Lastly, the freeing of all his slaves was conveniently at the end of his own life after he enjoyed the fruits of hundreds of enslaved people's labor. and many of these slaves likely would have left if given the opportunity. Washington many times would intentionally only allow his slaves to remain with him in Pennsylvania for less than 6 months, because Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act allowed any enslaved person to be considered free after being in the state for 6 continuous months. Washington even did this with his most trusted slaves, who worked within his home and interacted with him and his family on a daily basis. And even these individuals, who were given far more privileges than most at Mount Vernon, still chose to run away and seek freedom. That is all for this episode, but let me know what you think about President Washington's treatment of those he enslaved. What is your opinion about our nation's first president and his use of forced human labor to create significant wealth for himself? If you enjoyed this episode and you want to see more like it and hear about more presidents' history with slavery and human trafficking, be sure to click the subscribe button now, because there are new episodes every week and you don't want to miss them. Thanks for watching.